like to present the Refugee and Migrant Education Network again for you because we have participants of this conference that joined us only today, and I would like you to know more about this organization. And let me take a personal trip for a moment. I am a communications professor at Pontifical University of John Paul II in Krakow. I teach journalism and communications. I'm also an active journalist for Polish television and some international media outlets. But I discovered throughout the years that it's not about the communications. It's not about communicating. It's about the people you meet, and it's about human relations. So let me tell you a really short story of our network through the story of 3 remarkable encounters that I had. The first encounter happened only a week ago, on Friday, when I was waking up my 6-year-old daughter, Helena. I discovered that she has a fever. So of course, like a hot thunder went through my body when I was thinking of all the meetings that I have to cancel because she has a fever and I have to stay home with her. So obviously I opened my computer an hour later after giving her all the medicine because I had to prepare this conference. And all of a sudden, when she was watching her favorite cartoon about a brave princess, she asked me, "Mommy, what are you working on?" And I said, "I'm working on a network." "What network?" "A refugee network." "What's a refugee?" She asked, "What's a refugee?" because she didn't have an idea. Then I said, "Well, a refugee is a girl like you who has to flee her home with her mommy and daddy and her brothers and sisters. Why she has to escape?" Escape is like a more proper Polish word for that. And I said, "Well, because it's not safe for them to stay at their home." She looked at me, you know, with a, she asked me, "So is it not safe to stay in a house like ours?" And I said, "No, they have to go." And she looked at me, you know, only like a 6-year-old can look at you with so much trouble in her face, her eyes wide open and eyebrows lifted, and she said, "Oh, poor people." And you know, I think that a framing of a refugee and an empathy, a certain kind of empathy in her was framed in this little kid. And there won't be all of the households where the answer to the question, who is a refugee, would be like that. In the United States, a teenager turns on the TV and the framing of a refugee is done in a completely different way. So how can we help it? Well, as universities, we can obviously teach about migrants and refugees. And yesterday, we told you that this network is about connecting institutions that are willing to educate migrants and refugees wherever they are, whether it's a country of asylum or it's a refugee camp. But it's also about educating about refugees and migrants. And as university professors, we're really on the front line of that. We really have to educate our societies. And why? Archbishop Auza explained it in a perfect way. That's what Pope Francis said repeatedly. And actually, only a month ago, we met with Father Fabio Baggio, who is a right hand to the Pope in migrant and refugee issues. He's an undersecretary of migrant and refugee section. And he said exactly that. Universities are educating future leaders. And those leaders need to have a certain opinion about refugees and migrants and know who they are and advocate for them, being educated by our institutions. So we plan to organize, as I told you yesterday, some of you that were here yesterday, we plan not only to organize webinars in our Refugee and Migrant Education Network with experts who are providing migrant and refugee education wherever the migrants are, but also webinars with refugees so that our students at our campuses can meet their peers somewhere there in Kenya, somewhere there in Iraq, to know that they're wonderful people who just want to be educated, just like them, just like the Italians, the French, the Germans. My second recollection and the second meeting and the second encounter I would like to tell you about happened exactly 10 years ago. It was in Georgia, Caucasus, not Georgia, US. So the country was just invaded by Russia. And obviously all the international leaders, it was still a time where international leaders actually cared They came to Georgia to advocate for the country. There was President Sarkozy, there was President Yushchenko and Kaczynski. But when they left, for journalists, and I was a journalist at the time, there was kind of no story to cover. The politicians are gone. So I told my producer, listen, I'm going to a refugee camp in Gori to do a story from there. And he looked at me and he said, where are you going? And I said, to a refugee camp. Well, what kind of story you want to find in a refugee camp? And obviously I didn't listen to him, I went. And well, my first encounter was with a nice Polish doctor working in a medical camp who happens to be my husband for 9 years, because a year after meeting him in this refugee camp, I married him. But the most important meeting I want to tell you about is meeting the people. And the last thing you could tell about those people is that they're refugees. There were carpenters, farmers, cardiologists, teachers, mothers, fathers, schoolboys, schoolgirls, learning how to count by putting apples on the floor. Accepting refugees in our classrooms is not really accepting refugees. It's accepting students. And I think that Carrie Bystrom brought that to the room today. She said that in Bard College, accepting refugee students completely changed their perspective, completely transformed their institution. And in Refugee and Migrant Education Network, we think exactly of that, of thinking about it as a normality. And I'll refer again to what Father Baggio told us. Migration is here to stay. And Pope Francis says it repeatedly. It's a phenomenon that is here, and we have to get used to it. And together, by connecting institutions in Refugee and Migrant Education Network, we want to make it a normality to cooperate, to provide education, both for refugees and migrants, and about refugees and migrants. And this is the first network that brings together universities, non-governmental organizations, and entrepreneurs. Because obviously we were told today in the morning that those programs are expensive. Those programs need technology. So we need entrepreneurs, we need business to provide also technology and money for running such projects. And my third encounter that I would like to tell you about is an encounter from a year ago, exactly. It's an encounter with Pope Francis, who received us, the participants of the Rome conference, at the private audience. And probably most of you in the room admire Pope Francis, not because he's a religious leader, not all of you are Catholics in this room, but just because who he is and what he represents by his deeds. And well, I must tell you that shaking his hands is something that makes you feel you don't want to wash your hands until the rest of your life. It was a remarkable experience, but also because of his perseverance and confidence in delivering both the message of peace and welcoming migrants and refugees into our communities. You actually feel it when you meet this man, and I can tell you that. And the professor who lives in me, I told you a journalist story, but I also have a professor that lives in me. So I decided to do research on how Pope Francis communicates refugee crisis and migration. And I analyzed his speeches, and it turned out that he's doing what a great communications director would do. So he has a vision overacting. He has a proactive mentality to take the lead in promoting change, and he's giving maximum attention to content. That's what he's doing. The words that he's using, talking about refugees and migrants, is mostly humans, brothers, sisters, and people. That's his number one. So talking about research is the third thing that you see in our logo. So Refugee and Migrant Education Network is also to share research among members, among institutions, practical research that we would put in service of refugees and migrants. And I didn't see the gentleman who asked the question about research, but I do see a very much of a sense of doing research as a professor and as a practical person. I mean, I'm a journalist. Journalists couldn't be more practical. I mean, we cut people's interviews into 15-second sound bites. And I really do see the sense of doing research. And you know, to end this presentation really, because I believe that you already know a lot about our network, and I obviously encourage you to join, is that you know, working as a journalist, I can't really focus when I have silence around me. So I couldn't focus to write the speech and to think about the speech in my apartment, so I took the subway. I took subway #1, and I thought I'll get off wherever it takes me, like when I finish this speech, I'll get off. I finished exactly in Times Square. So I got into the surface, and I thought this city gave birth to a hope for so many people. And meeting at this conference, Refugee and Migrant Education Conference, just makes so much sense in this city to give birth to a hope. And if one person gets higher education, one refugee or one migrant, because of what we do, that's for me turning hopes into realities. And only 1% of 68 million people that are refugees in the world get higher education, and we're here to make that percentage change. And I welcome you to do it with us. I thank the existing members of the network for doing it with us, and I hope we'll meet again in some crazy place in the world to talk about refugee and migrant education next time. Thank you.